August 1945. The island of Okinawa lies in ruins after 3 months of brutal fighting. Japanese soldiers crouch in caves and tunnels, knowing the war is lost, but prepared to fight to the death. For weeks they have survived on almost nothing. A handful of rice mixed with whatever can be foraged. Tree bark boiled into bitter soup, insects and roots dug from the ground. Most men are skeletal, their bodies consuming themselves to stay alive. Their once proud uniforms are tattered and stained, hanging on frames that have shed 30 or 40 pounds. The supply ships from mainland Japan have stopped coming months ago. No food convoys arrive. Some soldiers have resorted to eating grass. Others have chewed on leather straps from equipment just to fill their stomachs with something. Everyone knows the emperor will soon announce surrender. The question is no longer if they will be defeated, but whether they will live to see that day. When American Marines finally clear the caves and tunnels, thousands of soldiers emerge. They stumble into the sunlight, many barely able to walk. They raise their hands, expecting execution. Japanese military doctrine has taught them that surrender brings unbearable shame. They have been told that Americans torture prisoners, that prisoners will be mutilated and killed, that the enemy shows no mercy. These young men, many in their early 20s, brace themselves for death. Instead, something completely unexpected happens. American corpsmen rush forward with medical supplies. Marines offer them water from their canteens. Within hours, the captured Japanese are given basic medical examinations and sorted by injury severity. The men exchange confused glances. Perhaps this is temporary kindness before the executions begin. They are loaded onto trucks and transported to temporary detention areas. The trucks drive through devastated Okinawan villages, past destroyed gun emplacements, until they reach a secure compound of tents and hastily erected wooden structures surrounded by barbed wire. Here, the first profound shock occurs. An American officer, speaking through a Japanese-American interpreter, tells the prisoners they will be fed immediately and given medical treatment. The men can hardly process what they are hearing. Fed? By the enemy? This violates everything they know about warfare and honor. They are led to a field mess area where American cooks are preparing a meal. The smell reaches them first. Cooking rice, but not the meager portions they remember. Real protein cooking, not the occasional small fish they might have received. Enormous pots of stew simmer over field stoves. Stacks of white rice, more than most of these men have seen in a year, sit in large containers. American soldiers are eating casually from metal trays, their plates loaded with quantities of food that seem impossible. The Japanese prisoners form a line, many stumbling from weakness. Each receives a tray. An American cook scoops a large portion of beef stew onto the tray. Another adds a substantial mound of white rice. A third places 2 slices of white bread beside the rice. The Japanese stare at their trays in absolute disbelief. This is more food than they would have received in 3 days as soldiers of the Imperial Army. Surely this is a mistake. Surely someone will realize they have been given portions meant for American troops and take it away. But the Americans gesture for them to sit and eat, showing no intention of reducing the portions. The prisoners find spots on the ground to sit. Around them, men are exhibiting shock in different ways. One soldier begins to tremble uncontrollably. Another makes a sound between a laugh and a sob. A third simply stares at his tray, tears running down his face. Then, slowly at first, they begin to eat. They eat with the desperation of starving men, bringing the food to their mouths with shaking hands. The beef stew is rich and savory, filled with chunks of actual meat. The rice is perfectly cooked, soft and filling. The bread is unlike anything in Japanese military rations, soft and slightly sweet. Some men eat so quickly they vomit and have to pause before continuing more slowly. Within 20 minutes, most of the prisoners have emptied their trays completely. They sit holding empty dishes, expecting guards to order them to move along. Instead, something even more incomprehensible happens. The American cook walks through the group with his pots, offering additional servings. Additional servings? In the Imperial Japanese Army, rations were strictly controlled and increasingly scarce. To ask for more was to invite severe punishment. To expect more was unthinkable. But here, the American simply gestures with a ladle, indicating prisoners can have more if they want it. Some prisoners are too stunned to move. Others hesitantly hold out their trays. Those who accept the second portion eat more carefully this time, trying to understand what is happening. This cannot be real. Enemy soldiers do not feed prisoners this way. There must be some ulterior motive they cannot yet see. Over the following days and weeks, as Japanese prisoners are processed and transported to larger facilities on Guam, Hawaii, and eventually the American mainland, the abundant feeding continues. On the transport ships, they receive 3 meals every single day. Each meal includes protein, rice or bread, vegetables, and occasionally fruit. The portions are larger than what they received as free soldiers before the war began. No one goes hungry. The men begin to discuss among themselves what this means. Some believe it is a form of psychological manipulation, designed to make them forget their honor and loyalty to the emperor. Others think the Americans are foolish and wasteful, not understanding proper military discipline. A few begin to question whether everything they were taught about America was propaganda. If they lied about American treatment of prisoners, what else was false? What other truths were hidden from them? The ships eventually arrive at ports in Hawaii and California. The Japanese prisoners get their first glimpse of America from the deck. The sight staggers them. Pearl Harbor, which they attacked less than 4 years ago, has been completely rebuilt. Ships crowd the harbor, more ships than they imagined America possessed. On the California coast, cities stretch along the shore, completely undamaged by war. Buildings stand intact. Electric lights shine across the landscape despite the ongoing conflict. In Japan, cities have been reduced to ash by American bombing. Rationing has made every item precious. But here, America shows no visible signs of hardship. The prisoners stare in silence. One man whispers that it is like looking at a country from a dream, untouched and impossible. The prisoners are loaded onto trains and transported across America to POW camps, located primarily in the western states and the South. These facilities have been built according to international standards, with wooden barracks, dining halls, recreation areas, medical clinics, and guard towers. When the Japanese prisoners march through the gates of their assigned camps, they see something that contradicts their expectations of imprisonment. The compounds are orderly and well-maintained. There are open areas with equipment for sports and exercise. Some camps have buildings designated for crafts and education. Small gardens where prisoners can grow vegetables. The barracks, while basic, are weatherproof and heated. Each prisoner receives a cot with a mattress, 2 blankets, and a small locker for personal items. Then comes dinner on their first full day. The mess hall is a long building with rows of tables and benches. The prisoners enter and are directed to a serving line. Behind the counter, American cooks and Japanese prisoner volunteers are preparing the evening meal. The Japanese watch as the men ahead of them receive their trays. A large piece of fried fish, a substantial portion of white rice, cooked vegetables, a bread roll, a cup of soup. When their turns come, they receive identical portions. They carry their trays to tables and sit down, still struggling to comprehend what they are seeing. This is not prison food. This is better than what most of them ate before the war. Better than what their families are eating now in Japan. The fried fish is flaky and well-seasoned. The rice is abundant and perfectly prepared. The vegetables have been cooked with butter. The roll is soft and warm. The soup, a simple miso-style broth, reminds them of home but is richer than anything they have tasted in years. As days become weeks and weeks become months, the Japanese prisoners begin to adjust to a reality that seems to violate all their previous understanding of the world. They learn that the meals they received on their first day were not special welcome rations or temporary abundance. This is the standard. Every single day, 3 times a day, they receive generous portions of food. Breakfast includes rice or bread, sometimes both. Eggs, occasionally bacon or sausage, coffee or tea. Lunch is substantial, with a main protein dish, rice, vegetables, and fruit when available. Dinner is the largest meal, with meat or fish, multiple side dishes, bread, and sometimes dessert. The variety astonishes them. One day there might be chicken, the next day pork, the day after that beef. Fish appears regularly. The rice never runs out. The bread is always fresh. But the true revelation comes when prisoners discover the camp canteen. This is a small store where prisoners can purchase items using scrip they earn from work assignments within the camp. The first time a group of Japanese prisoners enters the canteen, they stop in the doorway, frozen by what they see. The shelves are stocked with goods. Not a few items rationed carefully, but shelves full of products, Coca-Cola in bottles, candy bars of various types, chewing gum, cigarettes, cookies and crackers, canned fruit, peanut butter, jam, chocolate, soap, toothpaste, playing cards, magazines. The quantity and variety overwhelmed them. In Japan, even before the war, many of these items were luxuries available only to the wealthy. Now, as prisoners in an enemy country, they can purchase them with money earned from simple work assignments. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Takeshi, describes his first purchase at the canteen in a letter he writes home after the war. He saved his scrip for a week, earning small amounts by helping maintain the campgrounds. When he finally entered the canteen, he was drawn to a display of chocolate bars. He had tasted chocolate only once before the war, at a wedding celebration in Tokyo. It was expensive and rare. He assumed that in America, chocolate must be even more precious. But the price listed on the candy bar was modest, requiring only a few days of his accumulated scrip. He purchased one bar, handling it carefully as if it might break or disappear. Outside the canteen, he unwrapped it slowly. Other prisoners gathered around to watch. He broke off a small piece and placed it in his mouth. The sweetness flooded his senses. The rich flavor, the smooth texture, the way it melted slightly in his mouth. He stood motionless, eyes closed, experiencing something he thought he would never taste again. When he opened his eyes, he saw other prisoners weeping openly. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of being an enemy prisoner eating chocolate that he purchased in a store, in a camp where he was fed 3 large meals every day. The psychological impact of this abundance cannot be overstated. These men have been raised in a culture that emphasized sacrifice, deprivation, and collective suffering for the good of the nation. They were taught that material comfort weakened the spirit, that hardship built character, that wanting more than the minimum was selfish and dishonorable. The military intensified these beliefs, treating soldiers as expendable resources to be used and discarded. Food was fuel, nothing more. To expect flavor or variety or satisfaction was to think too much of oneself. Then suddenly, they are prisoners in America, and they are eating better than they have ever eaten. They are gaining weight for the first time in years. Their bodies are recovering from malnutrition, and they are being allowed, even encouraged, to purchase luxuries from a camp store. The contradiction breaks something in their minds. If America can feed prisoners this well while fighting a total war, what does that say about American power? What does it say about Japanese propaganda that claimed America was weak and decadent? Medical records from the POW camps document remarkable transformations. Japanese prisoners arriving from Pacific battlefields typically weighed between 90 and 110 pounds, far below healthy ranges. Camp doctors noted symptoms of severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, intestinal parasites, and various diseases related to starvation. The American military protocol required that all prisoners receive medical treatment and adequate food. Within 3 months of arrival, prisoners typically gained 15 to 25 pounds. Within 6 months, many had gained 30 to 40 pounds. Their bodies filled out. Muscle replaced the wasted flesh of starvation. Skin conditions improved as vitamin-rich diets took effect. Energy levels increased. One camp doctor wrote in his reports that transforming starving enemy soldiers into healthy prisoners was one of the most satisfying experiences of his medical career. He noted that many prisoners expressed disbelief at their own physical recovery, touching their faces and arms as if to verify they were real. The prisoners are assigned work details, as permitted under the Geneva Convention. They work on farms, in food processing plants, in lumber camps, helping to address American labor shortages caused by millions of men serving overseas. The Japanese prisoners are astonished by what they see in American agriculture. Farms operate with machinery on a scale unimaginable in Japan. Tractors and combines work vast fields. Irrigation systems cover thousands of acres. Storage facilities hold grain in quantities that could feed a Japanese village for years. When prisoners work at food processing plants, they see production lines producing thousands of cans per hour. When they work in lumber camps, they watch machines fell trees that would take Japanese workers days to cut down by hand. The efficiency and scale of American industry, even American agriculture, demonstrates a level of development far beyond what they expected. These are not just technological differences. These represent a fundamentally different relationship between humans and resources. America has not just more, but vastly more. So much more that feeding enemy prisoners generously barely registers as a cost. Some prisoners work in camp kitchens, giving them direct access to the food supply chain. A prisoner named Hiroshi, who worked as a cook's assistant, later wrote about his experiences. He described the delivery trucks that arrived daily with fresh meat, eggs, milk, vegetables, and bread. He noted that the quantities seemed excessive, more than the camp population could possibly consume. When he asked an American cook about this, the cook shrugged and said there was always plenty, and it was better to have extra than to run short. This casual attitude toward abundance shocked Hiroshi more than almost anything else. In Japan, every grain of rice was precious. In America, having extra food was considered normal planning. He watched American soldiers discard partially eaten meals, throwing away more food than a Japanese family might eat in a day. He saw waste that would have caused riots in Tokyo. But here it was routine. barely noticed. The gap between the two nations became clear not in the abundance provided to prisoners, but in the abundance wasted without thought. The camp libraries contain books in Japanese, provided by the American government to keep prisoners occupied and educated. The prisoners read American newspapers, learning about the progress of the war from the other perspective. They are shocked to discover how thoroughly Japan is losing. The propaganda they received as soldiers painted a picture of Japanese victories and American desperation. The newspapers tell a different story. American forces are advancing across the Pacific. Japanese cities are being bombed regularly. The Japanese military is being systematically destroyed. Most disturbing, the newspapers casually mention production figures that seem impossible. America is producing thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, millions of tons of supplies. The numbers are so large they seem like fantasy. But the prisoners are living inside American abundance. They eat the food, they see the trucks and machinery. They experience firsthand the evidence that these impossible numbers might be real. Social interactions between prisoners and guards are surprisingly cordial in many camps. American guards are primarily older men or those medically unfit for combat duty. They maintain security but do not abuse prisoners. Many guards are curious about Japan and Japanese culture. Some attempt to learn basic Japanese phrases. Others engage prisoners in conversations about the war, their families, their lives before military service. The prisoners find this casual fraternization strange. In the Japanese military, relationships between ranks are rigid and hierarchical. But Americans seem to treat guards and prisoners as simply men who happen to be on opposite sides of a war. This egalitarian approach unsettles prisoners who have been taught that hierarchy and rank define all relationships. But it also creates opportunities for understanding. Prisoners who learn English and converse with guards begin to see Americans as individuals rather than a faceless enemy. They learn that Americans worry about their own families overseas, that they hope the war ends soon, that they miss home and want to return to normal life. These conversations humanize the enemy in ways that propaganda never could. The first winter in American camps brings another revelation. The prisoners have been told that America cannot sustain a war effort, that American civilians are suffering, that the American economy is collapsing. But when winter comes, the camps remain heated. The prisoners are issued warm jackets, gloves, and boots. Food supplies do not decrease. In fact, holiday meals in December include turkey, ham, special desserts, and larger portions than usual. The prisoners learn that Americans celebrate Christmas with elaborate meals and gift-giving. In Japan, civilians are freezing and starving. Cities are being reduced to rubble. But here, in a prisoner of war camp, Japanese prisoners are eating turkey and staying warm while American citizens celebrate their holidays with apparent abundance. The cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable for some prisoners. They begin writing letters home when mail service is eventually established, trying to describe what they are experiencing. But how can they explain that being a prisoner in America is better than being a free citizen in wartime Japan? How can they tell their families that they are gaining weight while their relatives are starving? Some choose to say nothing, feeling guilty about their circumstances. When the atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the news reaches the camps quickly. The prisoners react with shock, horror, and grief. Many have family in the affected areas. The magnitude of the destruction seems beyond comprehension. But in the following days, as more information emerges, another realization settles over the camps. America possessed weapons of such power that they could vaporize entire cities instantly. America chose to use these weapons to end the war quickly. America demonstrated technological capabilities so far advanced that resistance was meaningless. The prisoners discuss what this means. They have been living in American camps for months, eating American food, experiencing American abundance, and seeing American efficiency. Now they learn that America also possesses the ultimate weapon. The conclusion is inescapable. Japan never had a chance. The war was lost before it began. They were sent to fight an enemy so powerful that conventional warfare was irrelevant. When Japan officially surrenders in September 1945, the prisoners face an uncertain future. They expect immediate execution now that the war is over. There is precedent in Japanese history for victors executing defeated enemies, but the executions never come. Instead, American officials announce that repatriation will occur as soon as transport can be arranged. The meantime, prisoners will continue to be housed, fed, and allowed to work for pay if they choose. The prisoners wait for months, then more than a year. The delay is not intentional cruelty, but logistical challenge. The American military is simultaneously demobilizing millions of soldiers, occupying Japan and Germany, and trying to arrange transport for hundreds of thousands of prisoners scattered across America. The Japanese prisoners continue their routines. They work, they study, they play sports, they read, they eat their 3 large meals every day. They visit the canteen to purchase small luxuries. They live in a strange limbo, technically prisoners, but experiencing more freedom, security, and abundance than they knew as soldiers or civilians in Japan. The repatriation process finally begins in 1946 and continues into 1947. The prisoners are transported back to Japan by ship. As they approach the Japanese coast, they see the devastation from the sea. Cities are flattened. Ports are destroyed. The infrastructure of the nation has been shattered. When they disembark, they step into a world of ruins. Japan is struggling to feed its population. Starvation is widespread. The black market thrives because official food rations are insufficient to sustain life. The prisoners, healthy and well-fed from their time in America, stand in stark contrast to the skeletal civilians around them. They have been prisoners, yet they are healthier than free Japanese citizens. This paradox is not lost on them or on the people who greet them. Families are simultaneously grateful their sons and husbands survived and confused by their robust appearance. How can prisoners of war look better than people who stayed home? The returning prisoners struggle to explain their experiences. They tell stories of food that seem like fantasy to people who are starving. They describe camp canteens stocked with candy and cigarettes. They talk about eating meat every day, sometimes twice a day. They mention that American prisoners worked on farms where the abundance was so great that waste was casual. Their listeners struggle to believe these accounts. Surely the prisoners are exaggerating. Surely they are misremembering. But as more prisoners return and tell similar stories, the accounts gain credibility. Something extraordinary happened to these men in America. They experienced a level of prosperity that contradicts everything Japanese civilians believe about the war and the enemy. If America could feed prisoners so well while fighting a total war, while developing atomic weapons, while supporting its own military across the entire Pacific, then what kind of power does America actually possess? The implications are staggering. Over the following years, as Japan rebuilds under American occupation, the former prisoners play a complicated role. On one hand, they are defeated soldiers, associated with a lost cause and national humiliation. On the other hand, They are witnesses to American power and character. They saw with their own eyes that propaganda lied. They experienced American fairness, at least according to the standards of prisoner treatment. They benefited from American abundance in ways that saved their lives. These experiences shaped their views during the occupation and beyond. When General Douglas MacArthur implements democratic reforms in Japan, many former prisoners are less resistant than might be expected. They have seen that American democracy produces results. They have lived inside American prosperity, even as prisoners. They know that cooperation with America might be practical rather than shameful. The psychological transformation these prisoners underwent is difficult for outsiders to comprehend. They were raised in a culture of sacrifice and deprivation. They were trained as soldiers to accept death without question. They were taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Then they surrendered and discovered that the consequences were not what they expected. They were treated with basic decency. They were fed better than they had been fed in years. They were allowed to maintain their dignity. Over time, many began to question the system that trained them. If the military leaders knew how prisoners would be treated, why did they insist that soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender? How many lives were thrown away needlessly because of false ideas about American brutality? These questions did not have easy answers, but they could not be ignored. The prisoners had evidence that contradicted their training. They could feel that evidence in their own bodies, in the weight they gained, in the health they recovered. The impact of food on memory and trauma deserves consideration. These men experienced extreme deprivation followed by unexpected abundance. The contrast created memories that lasted lifetimes. Decades after the war, former prisoners could describe specific meals in detail. They remembered the first time they tasted Coca-Cola, the texture and flavor creating an experience so novel it carved itself into memory. They remembered chocolate bars, fried fish, fresh bread, and rice bowls filled to overflowing. These food memories became markers for psychological transformation. Before the chocolate, they were soldiers of the emperor. After the chocolate, they were men questioning everything they had been taught. Food became the medium through which political and philosophical realizations occurred. What began as simple hunger satisfaction evolved into evidence of systemic differences between nations. American strategic thinking played a role in prisoner treatment, though perhaps not as consciously as some historians claim. The United States needed to demonstrate that it would follow international law and treat prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. This was partly to protect American prisoners held by Japan and Germany, though that protection often failed. It was partly to maintain moral legitimacy in a war where the enemy could be portrayed as barbaric. And it was partly because American culture valued rules and procedures, even during total war. But the effect went beyond strategy. By feeding prisoners well, America revealed its productive capacity in ways that propaganda never could. Enemy soldiers lived inside American abundance for months or years. They saw it, touched it, tasted it, and gained weight from it. When they returned home and told their stories, they became unwitting advocates for American power and prosperity. This was not the primary goal of prisoner treatment, but it was a significant side effect. The camps also served as impromptu cultural exchanges. American guards learned about Japanese culture, language, and customs from prisoners. Prisoners learned about American life, values, and systems from guards and civilian workers. This exchange occurred in an environment where both sides were relaxed enough to talk, but constrained enough to avoid serious conflict. The camps created a neutral space where enemies could interact as humans rather than combatants. Food facilitated many of these interactions. Guards and prisoners ate similar meals. They shared cigarettes during breaks. They traded stories about cooking and favorite dishes from home. These small moments of connection, multiplied across thousands of prisoners and hundreds of guards, created understanding that would have been impossible on the battlefield. Some prisoners maintained correspondence with American guards for years after returning to Japan. These friendships, born in prison camps, bridged cultures that had been at war. The Japanese-American translators who worked in the camps deserve recognition. These individuals were American citizens of Japanese descent, many of whom had family in Japan or had experienced discrimination and internment themselves. They served as bridges between cultures and languages, explaining American customs to prisoners and prisoner concerns to camp administrators. Their role was challenging and sometimes painful. They were ethnically Japanese but nationally American, and both sides occasionally viewed them with suspicion. Yet they performed essential work, making communication possible and often advocating for prisoner welfare. Many translators remember being moved by the condition of newly arrived prisoners, seeing in them what could have been their own relatives. They worked to ensure prisoners understood that they would be treated fairly, that the food was not poisoned, that cooperation would not result in punishment. Their efforts helped prisoners adjust to captivity and accept the reality of their circumstances. The story of Japanese prisoners and American food connects to larger historical patterns. Throughout history, victorious powers have used various methods to manage defeated enemies. Some chose brutal suppression. Others chose strategic generosity. The American approach, feeding prisoners well and treating them according to international standards, represented a form of soft power. It demonstrated American values and capabilities in ways that created lasting impressions. The prisoners who experienced this treatment became living proof that America was not the evil empire described in Japanese propaganda. They returned to Japan carrying evidence that complicated simple narratives of good versus evil. Their experiences suggested that perhaps the war was not about moral absolutes, but about national interests, strategic miscalculations, and human choices. This nuanced understanding, spread through thousands of returned prisoners, helped reshape Japanese attitudes toward America during the occupation and beyond. The economic implications are worth exploring. America fed hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners 3 substantial meals per day for months or years. The cost was significant but manageable within the vast American economy. For Japan, feeding its own military had become nearly impossible by 1945. The contrast revealed economic capacities that decided the war's outcome. Wars are often won by logistics and production capacity rather than battlefield heroics. The prisoners understood this viscerally. They had starved as soldiers. They grew strong as prisoners. The nation that could feed enemy prisoners while fighting across the globe was clearly more powerful than the nation that could barely feed its own troops. This lesson in practical economics stayed with the prisoners. Many became advocates for market economies and international trade after returning to Japan. They had seen what prosperity looked like and wanted it for their own country. The treatment of Japanese prisoners stands in sharp contrast to how Japan treated Allied prisoners. This comparison became unavoidable during war crimes trials in the late 1940s. Evidence emerged of systematic abuse, starvation, forced labor, and execution of Allied prisoners by Japanese forces. The Japanese public learned that their own prisoners in America ate 3 meals a day, while Allied prisoners in Japanese hands often starved or were worked to death. This knowledge contributed to national shame and willingness to reform. The former prisoners themselves struggled with this comparison. They had been treated well by an enemy that their own country treated horrifically. The guilt and confusion this created lasted decades. Some former prisoners became activists for peace and reconciliation, trying to atone for the crimes their country committed, even though they personally had been victims of war as much as perpetrators. As decades passed, and Japan became an economic powerhouse and close American ally, the story of POW camps took on new meaning. The former prisoners, now elderly men, reflected on how their wartime experiences shaped their lives. Many acknowledged that being captured saved them. If they had continued fighting, they likely would have died in final battles or suicide attacks. Instead, they surrendered, ate American food, recovered their health, and lived to return home and rebuild Japan. Some expressed gratitude for their time as prisoners, a sentiment that would have seemed impossible to their younger selves. They recognized that the Americans who fed them and treated them fairly had given them something precious, a second chance at life and the opportunity to contribute to Japan's post-war transformation. The food itself became symbolic in ways beyond its nutritional value. When former prisoners gathered for reunions, they often prepared American-style meals, attempting to recreate the dishes they ate in the camps. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, bread, and apple pie became comfort foods associated with survival and unexpected kindness. Some prisoners introduced these dishes to their families, explaining that this was what Americans eat. This was what gave them back their health. American food became Japanese-American fusion in some households, a culinary memorial to a transformative experience. The act of eating these foods decades later was a form of remembrance, keeping alive the memory of a time when enemies chose to be humane rather than brutal. The story intersects with broader questions about human nature and conflict. Why did America choose to feed prisoners so well? The Geneva Convention required adequate food, but America exceeded that minimum. Partly this reflected American abundance and logistical capability. Partly it reflected American legal and ethical commitments. But perhaps it also reflected an understanding that enemies are human beings whose circumstances could change. The soldiers serving as guards were not fundamentally different from the prisoners they guarded. Different choices, different birthplaces, but similar humanity. The American military culture, despite its own flaws and prejudices, maintained standards that prevented the worst abuses. This was not universal, exceptions existed, but it was systemic enough that most prisoners experienced treatment that preserved their dignity and health. The prisoners' experiences also raise questions about propaganda and truth. Every nation uses propaganda during war, simplifying complex realities into clear narratives of good versus evil. Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as brutal and decadent. American propaganda portrayed Japanese as fanatical and inhuman. Both narratives contained elements of truth and substantial exaggerations. The prisoners who lived inside American society, even in camps, encountered reality that contradicted propaganda. They learned that Americans were not uniformly brutal or decadent, but varied individuals working within systems that valued certain principles. This discovery did not make them love America or hate Japan, but it complicated their understanding in productive ways. Propaganda works best from a distance. Up close, humans are complex and contradictory, defying simple categorization. The camps themselves have largely disappeared. Most were temporary wooden structures torn down after the war. A few sites have been preserved or marked with historical plaques. Some former camps are now farms, industrial sites, or suburban developments. The physical infrastructure is gone, but the memories remain in photographs, documents, and the testimonies of men who lived there. Historical societies and museums have collected artifacts from the camps: eating utensils, camp script, photographs of prisoners playing sports or working. These objects tell stories of a strange period when enemies coexisted in American heartland camps, eating fried chicken and reading Japanese newspapers, waiting for a war to end and wondering what their futures held. As the 21st century progresses, the last survivors of these camps pass away. The generation that fought World War II in the Pacific is nearly extinct. Soon there will be no living memory of Japanese prisoners eating their first American meals. No eyewitness accounts of men weeping over chocolate bars. No survivors to describe the cognitive dissonance of gaining weight while being held captive. But the impact of their experiences continues. The Japanese-American alliance remains one of the strongest bilateral relationships in the world. Japan is a prosperous democracy and America's key partner in Asia. Some credit for this relationship belongs to the prisoners who returned from America with changed perspectives. They did not single-handedly create post-war reconciliation, but they contributed. They were witnesses to American power tempered by restraint. They were beneficiaries of a system that maintained standards even toward enemies, and they carried these experiences into Japan's post-war transformation. The food they ate in those camps, the fried fish and rice and chocolate and Coca-Cola that seemed so miraculous at the time, became symbols of something larger. They represented the gap between Japanese scarcity and American abundance. They demonstrated American logistical mastery and organizational skill. They showed that even during total war, America maintained prosperity, and they created memories that lasted lifetimes, memories of unexpected decency from unlikely sources. When these men talked about being stunned by American food servings, about standing disbelieving in front of camp canteens, about gaining 40 pounds in a year of captivity, they were talking about more than nutrition. They were talking about the moment their worldview shattered, when they realized that everything they had been taught was incomplete or false, that the enemy was more complex than propaganda claimed, and that different ways of organizing society produced radically different outcomes. The giant food servings, the Coca-Cola and candy bars, these were not just calories. They were evidence of an alternative reality. One where abundance replaced scarcity, where rules governed behavior, and where even enemies could be treated as human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. This evidence, experienced through the simple act of eating, transformed men and, in small but significant ways, helped transform the relationship between two nations that had been locked in brutal warfare. Individual stories from the camps reveal the human dimension of this experience in ways that statistics and general descriptions cannot capture. Consider the story of Kenji Yamamoto, a 23-year-old soldier from Kyoto who was captured on Saipan in July 1944. Kenji had been a university student studying literature before being drafted. He came from a middle-class family that owned a small textile business. Before the war, his family ate well by Japanese standards: rice at every meal, fish several times a week, occasional meat on special occasions, vegetables from their garden. But as the war progressed and resources became scarce, his family's diet deteriorated. By the time Kenji was drafted in 1943, meals at home consisted mainly of rice mixed with barley, miso soup with few ingredients, and whatever vegetables could be found. In the military, conditions were worse. Rations were meager and often spoiled. On Saipan, as American forces closed in, rations stopped entirely. Kenji survived for 2 weeks on whatever he could scavenge, losing nearly 40 pounds from an already thin frame. When Kenji was captured and brought to the processing center, he was given his first American meal. He later wrote in his memoir, published in Japan in the 1980s, about the surreal experience of sitting on the ground, holding a tray with more food than he had seen in months. He described picking up a piece of beef from the stew and examining it, trying to remember the last time he had eaten beef. It had been more than 2 years. The meat was tender and flavorful, nothing like the tough, scarce portions he remembered from before the war. He ate slowly, trying to make the meal last, convinced it would be his only good meal before whatever fate awaited him. When the American cook offered seconds, Kenji thought he had misunderstood. He asked the Japanese-American interpreter to repeat the words. Seconds? Additional food? The interpreter smiled and confirmed. Kenji held out his tray and received another ladle full of stew. He sat back down and wept openly, overwhelmed by the kindness and the food and the realization that he might actually survive. Kenji was transported to a camp in Texas, where he spent nearly 2 years. He worked in the camp kitchen, giving him a unique perspective on the food operation. He was amazed by the quantities of food delivered daily. Trucks would arrive with sides of beef, crates of chickens, sacks of rice, boxes of fresh vegetables, and commercial quantities of cooking oil, flour, and other staples. The American head cook, a sergeant from Iowa named Murphy, ran the kitchen with efficient precision. Murphy treated the Japanese workers with respect, teaching them American cooking techniques and occasionally asking about Japanese food traditions. Through their interactions, Kenji learned that Murphy had been a restaurant cook before the war and planned to open his own diner after returning home. Murphy's casual attitude toward food abundance struck Kenji as quintessentially American. When Kenji expressed amazement at the quantities of food, Murphy shrugged and said that in America, nobody should go hungry, not even enemy prisoners. Kenji gained 53 pounds during his time in the camp. He went from a skeletal 98 pounds at capture to a healthy 151 pounds by the time he was repatriated. The weight gain was not just physical recovery, but represented a complete transformation of his relationship with food and his understanding of what was possible in the world. In his memoir, he wrote that learning to cook American-style meals in that Texas camp kitchen taught him more about America than any book could have. He saw how abundance was not just about having more, but about organization, efficiency, and systems designed to prevent scarcity. The American military supply chain ensured that even a remote POW camp in Texas received regular deliveries of fresh food. The camp kitchen had commercial-grade equipment that made food preparation efficient. Nothing was left to chance or improvisation. Americans had systematized abundance. After returning to Japan in 1947, Kenji struggled to readjust. His family had survived the war, though their business was destroyed and they were living in temporary housing. Food was scarce across Japan. The American occupation was providing some relief supplies, but millions were malnourished. Kenji, healthy and strong from his time in the camp, felt guilty about his good condition. He tried to explain his experiences to his family, but words failed to convey the reality. How could he describe eating steak when his family was struggling to get rice? How could he talk about camp canteens stocked with candy when Japanese children were begging for food scraps? He learned to stay quiet about his experiences, speaking of them only years later when Japan's recovery made such stories less painful to hear. But privately, Kenji's time in the American camp shaped his entire post-war life. He became an English teacher, promoting cultural exchange and understanding. He wrote his memoir to record what happened, to document a piece of history that many Japanese preferred to forget. He wanted younger generations to understand that America's power was not just military might, but economic capacity and organizational skill applied to maintaining abundance even during total war. Another perspective comes from Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura, a naval officer captured when his destroyer was sunk near the Philippines in October 1944. Nakamura came from a military family. His father and grandfather had been Imperial Navy officers. He had been raised with strict codes of honor and Bushido principles. Surrender was literally worse than death in his worldview. When he found himself in the water after his ship sank, watching American sailors pull Japanese survivors into rescue boats, he seriously considered letting himself drown rather than accept capture. But survival instinct prevailed. He was pulled aboard an American destroyer, given a blanket, and offered hot coffee. The American sailors treated him with professional courtesy, not the brutality he expected. Within hours, he was eating a meal of chicken soup, bread, and fruit. The cognitive dissonance was profound. He had just tried to kill these men. They had just sunk his ship and killed many of his crew. Yet here they were feeding him chicken soup. Nakamura was transported to a POW camp in California, where he spent the remainder of the war. As an officer, he was housed in a section of the camp designated for officers and was not required to work. This gave him considerable time to observe, think, and question his beliefs. The food in the officer section was identical to what enlisted prisoners received, which itself was a revelation. In the Japanese military, officers ate better than enlisted men, a clear reflection of the rigid hierarchy. But Americans fed everyone the same, regardless of rank. This egalitarian approach puzzled Nakamura initially. He thought it showed lack of proper discipline and respect for hierarchy. But over time, he began to see it differently. Perhaps treating all prisoners equally was not weakness, but confidence. America could afford to feed everyone well, so distinctions were unnecessary. Nakamura kept a secret diary during his captivity, writing in tiny characters on whatever paper he could obtain. This diary, later donated to a Japanese historical archive, provides remarkable insight into his psychological journey. Early entries express shame, anger, and confusion. He writes about the indignity of surrender and his failure to die honorably. But as weeks pass, the entries begin to change. He writes about the food in detail, describing American meals as if cataloging evidence of an alien civilization. Fried chicken appears repeatedly in his entries. He cannot get over the abundance of chicken, the way it is prepared with crispy coating, the generous portions. He notes that in Japan, chicken was expensive and rarely eaten. Here, prisoners eat it several times a week. He calculates, based on the camp population and frequency of chicken meals, that thousands of chickens must be processed to feed this single camp. Multiply that by the number of camps holding Japanese prisoners, and the scale becomes staggering. What kind of nation produces chickens in such quantities that enemy prisoners can feast on them regularly? Later entries in Nakamura's diary explore deeper questions. He writes about conversations with other officer prisoners, debates about what their captivity means for Japan and Japanese identity. Some officers cling to traditional views, insisting that American treatment is psychological warfare designed to weaken their spirit. Others, like Nakamura himself, begin to question whether Japanese military doctrine was based on false assumptions. If America is as powerful and organized as their daily experience suggests, Perhaps Japan's leaders made catastrophic miscalculations. Perhaps the war was unwinnable from the start. These were dangerous thoughts for a naval officer raised in military tradition, but the evidence was undeniable. They were being fed 3 large meals every day. The food never ran out. The system never failed. American logistics, applied even to enemy prisoners, functioned flawlessly. This was the evidence of American power, more convincing than any propaganda. Nakamura returned to Japan in 1946, a changed man. His father, who survived the war, was disappointed by his son's surrender and initially refused to speak to him. The shame of capture hung over Nakamura for years, but he rebuilt his life, eventually becoming a businessman and later a consultant helping Japanese companies understand American business practices. His time as a POW, observing American systems and organization, gave him insights that proved valuable in Japan's post-war economic development. He never forgot the food, the abundance, the systematic efficiency. In his old age, in interviews conducted by historians, Nakamura said that being captured and fed by Americans probably did more to change his worldview than any other experience in his life. It broke through the propaganda and showed him reality. America was not weak or decadent. It was staggeringly powerful and efficient. That knowledge, gained through the simple act of eating 3 meals a day, shaped his entire post-war career and his efforts to help Japan learn from American methods. The experience of ordinary enlisted men provides yet another perspective. Corporal Hideo Tanaka was a farm boy from rural Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan. He had grown up poor, working his family's small farm. Food was always scarce in his childhood. His family ate rice mixed with cheaper grains, vegetables from their garden, fish when they could catch or afford it. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for festivals and special occasions. When Hideo was drafted, military rations were better than what he ate at home, at least initially. But by the time he was sent to New Guinea in 1943, rations had deteriorated to almost nothing. In the jungles of New Guinea, Japanese soldiers starved by the thousands. Disease and malnutrition killed more men than combat. Hideo survived by eating anything he could find. Insects, roots, plants that might be poisonous but were worth the risk. He watched friends die from starvation. He buried men who weighed 70 pounds when they died. When American and Australian forces finally captured the remnants of his unit in 1944, Hideo weighed 86 pounds and was too weak to walk. The Australians evacuated him to a military hospital, where doctors worked to save his life. He was fed intravenously at first, his stomach unable to handle solid food after months of near starvation. Gradually, he was given soups, then soft foods, then regular meals. The Australian medical staff treated him with professional care, focused on recovery rather than punishment. When he was healthy enough to travel, he was shipped to a POW camp in Australia and later transferred to a camp in the United States. By the time Hideo arrived at the American camp, he had regained some weight but was still painfully thin. The American camp put him on a high-calorie diet designed to restore his health. For months, he received larger portions than other prisoners, along with extra milk, eggs, and protein supplements. Camp doctors monitored his progress weekly, adjusting his diet as needed. Hideo had never experienced medical care like this. In rural Hokkaido, doctors were expensive and rarely consulted except for serious illness. The idea that enemy doctors would care about his nutritional recovery seemed impossible. But they did. They tracked his weight gain. They checked for vitamin deficiencies. They ensured he received food that would rebuild his strength. Within 6 months, Hideo weighed 135 pounds, a weight he had never achieved even in his healthiest days before the war. He looked in mirrors and saw a stranger. He had muscles. His face had filled out. His skin had color. He was healthier as a prisoner of war than he had been as a free man in Japan. This realization troubled Hideo deeply. What did it mean that enemy captivity provided better living conditions than freedom in his own country? What did it say about Japan that a poor farm boy received better nutrition and medical care in an American POW camp than he ever received at home? These questions had no comfortable answers. Hideo was not educated enough to understand complex economic or political theories, but he understood lived experience. He knew what hunger felt like. He knew what it meant to have enough food. And he knew that America, even while fighting a war, ensured that enemy prisoners had enough food and medical care. That knowledge stayed with him forever. After repatriation, Hideo returned to Hokkaido and resumed farming. His family's land had survived the war, though equipment was lacking and supplies were scarce. Hideo worked hard to rebuild the farm, applying some of the agricultural knowledge he gained from working on American farms during his captivity. He had learned about crop rotation, fertilizer use, and efficient planting techniques from American farmers. He tried to implement these methods on his small farm with mixed success. The scale was different, resources were limited, but some techniques helped increase yields. Hideo married in 1950 and started a family. He told his children stories about the war, but he carefully controlled which stories he shared. He talked about the hardship, the fear, the loss. He did not talk much about the food in American camps. How could he explain to his children, who sometimes went to bed hungry in the hard post-war years, that their father ate better as a prisoner than as a free man? It seemed like a betrayal of their suffering to speak of abundance he experienced while they struggled. Only in his old age, when Japan had become prosperous and his grandchildren grew up in comfort, did Hideo speak openly about his POW experiences. He told them about the first meal he received after being captured, how he cried into his rice because it was the first real food he had eaten in months. He described working on American farms and seeing agricultural abundance that seemed impossible to someone from a small Hokkaido farm. He explained how American doctors cared for his health, how American cooks ensured he gained weight, how the system worked to restore him even though he was supposed to be the enemy. His grandchildren, growing up in modern Japan with supermarkets full of food and a standard of living among the highest in the world, struggled to imagine their grandfather starving in a jungle or crying over a bowl of rice. But these stories were part of his legacy, his way of ensuring the younger generation understood the path Japan had traveled from devastation to prosperity. The camp newspapers, created by and for prisoners, provide another window into the POW experience. Several camps produced newsletters in Japanese, written by prisoners and approved by American administrators. These newsletters covered camp news, sports results, educational opportunities, and occasionally featured prisoner artwork and poetry. But food appears constantly in these publications. Prisoners wrote poems about meals. They drew sketches of camp kitchens. They published recipes for Japanese dishes they hoped to cook when they returned home. They described American foods in detail, trying to document for themselves and possibly for family members what they were experiencing. One newsletter from a camp in Arkansas included a detailed article explaining what a hamburger was, complete with diagrams showing the assembly of the sandwich. The author described the beef patty, the soft bun, the lettuce and tomato, the condiments. He wrote that hamburgers represented something essentially American. This abundance of beef transformed into a casual food that even prisoners could eat regularly. Another newsletter featured an essay about ice cream, describing the cold sweetness and the variety of flavors available at the camp canteen. The author noted that ice cream seemed to symbolize American excess and luxury, turned into something ordinary. These newsletters reveal how prisoners were trying to process and document their experiences. They knew that what they were living through was unusual, possibly historic. They wanted to record it, to make sense of it, to create a shared narrative among prisoners. Food became a safe topic around which to build this narrative. They could write about meals without touching on more sensitive subjects like military defeat or political implications. But the food writing inevitably led to deeper questions. If America produces ice cream for prisoners, what does that say about American civilization? If hamburgers are considered ordinary food, what kind of agricultural system makes that possible? The prisoners were using food writing as a way to think through the larger meaning of their captivity. The art created by prisoners also frequently featured food themes. Some camps organized art programs, providing prisoners with basic supplies to create drawings and paintings. Food appeared in this art constantly. Prisoners drew pictures of rice bowls, fish, vegetables, traditional Japanese meals they remembered from home. But they also drew American foods: stacks of pancakes, fried chicken, apple pies, ice cream cones. One particularly talented prisoner created a series of watercolors showing the evolution of his meals from military rations to starvation in the field to abundance in the POW camp. The series served as a visual memoir of his journey through the war. Another prisoner carved wooden sculptures of various foods, creating three-dimensional memories of the meals he ate. These artworks sometimes found their way home when prisoners were repatriated, carrying physical evidence of the POW experience into Japanese homes. The religious dimension of the camp experience deserves attention. Many camps provided space and time for religious observance. Buddhist and Shinto priests among the prisoners led ceremonies and services. American administrators, respecting freedom of religion, allowed these practices to continue. Prisoners gathered to pray, to remember the dead, to seek meaning in their circumstances. Food intersected with religious practice in significant ways. Some prisoners gave thanks before meals, expressing gratitude for abundance they had not expected. Others performed food offerings as part of Buddhist practice, setting aside small portions of their meals for deceased comrades. The act of having enough food to make offerings was itself meaningful. In times of starvation, offering food to the dead was impossible. But in American camps, prisoners could honor both their living bodies and their spiritual traditions. Some prisoners experienced spiritual transformations related to food. The Buddhist concept of gratitude took on new meaning when they had food to be grateful for. The Shinto emphasis on purity and proper offerings became possible when clean food was available. A prisoner named Masaru Ito, who later became a Buddhist priest, wrote about how his camp experiences deepened his faith. He described feeling profound gratitude, not necessarily to Americans, but to whatever forces in the universe had brought him to a place where he would not starve. He wrote about the spiritual practice of eating mindfully, paying attention to each bite, honoring the life that died to provide food. In the American camp, he had time and food to practice this mindfulness in ways that were impossible during military service. His spiritual transformation occurred in the unlikely setting of an enemy POW camp, facilitated by the simple fact of having enough to eat. The educational programs in the camps also connected to food in unexpected ways. American authorities established educational opportunities for prisoners, teaching English, mathematics, history, and vocational skills. These programs were partly humanitarian, giving prisoners productive ways to occupy their time. But they were also strategic, aimed at introducing prisoners to democratic ideas and American culture. Food appeared in these educational contexts frequently. English lessons included vocabulary for foods, meals, and cooking. Math lessons involved calculating recipes and food quantities. History lessons discussed American agriculture and industrial development. Prisoners learned that American abundance was not accidental, but resulted from specific choices about technology, organization, and economic systems. These lessons, combined with their daily experience of being well-fed, created powerful learning moments. One prisoner, Yoshiro Suzuki, attended every English class offered in his camp. He studied intensely, determined to master the language. His motivation was practical. He believed Japan would need people who understood America in the post-war period. Learning English from camp teachers, he also learned about American culture and values. Many lessons involved food because it was a universal topic that could teach language while providing cultural context. Yoshiro learned the English words for dozens of American foods. He learned American table manners. He practiced conversations about meals and restaurants. When he returned to Japan, his English skills and cultural knowledge helped him secure a job with an American company operating in occupied Japan. That job launched a career in international business. He always credited his POW camp education, including the mundane lessons about American food, with giving him opportunities he never would have had otherwise. The economic impact of POW labor in American agriculture was substantial, but often overlooked. Thousands of Japanese prisoners worked on farms across the American South and West. They picked cotton, harvested vegetables, worked in food processing plants, and performed other agricultural tasks. This labor helped address wartime labor shortages. Prisoners were paid small wages, deposited into accounts they could access after repatriation. American farmers generally treated their prisoner workers reasonably well, understanding that well-fed, fairly treated workers were more productive. Some prisoners developed relationships with the farming families they worked for, learning about American rural life and agricultural methods. These work assignments gave prisoners intimate access to American agricultural abundance. Working in fields that stretched to the horizon, they saw the scale of American farming. Using tractors and modern equipment, they experienced the efficiency of mechanized agriculture. Loading trucks with harvest yields that would feed thousands, they understood American productive capacity in visceral ways. A prisoner working on a California fruit farm wrote in a letter home about picking more fruit in one day than his entire village in Japan would consume in a month. The scale was incomprehensible to someone from small-scale Japanese agriculture. But working in these fields day after day, seeing the yields and the efficiency, prisoners became believers in American agricultural power. When they returned to Japan and tried to describe what they had seen, many found that words failed to convey the reality. Only direct experience could communicate the sheer scale of American food production. Some prisoners formed genuine friendships with American farmers and their families. This was against regulations, but occurred nonetheless. Prisoners working on family farms sometimes ate meals with the family, sharing food and conversation despite the language barrier. These moments of connection, enemy soldiers and American farmers breaking bread together, represented humanity transcending war. One particularly poignant story involves a Japanese prisoner named Kenji Sato, who worked on a farm in Colorado. The elderly farmer who owned the property had lost his son in the Pacific War. Initially, he requested Japanese workers reluctantly, needing labor but uncomfortable with the idea. but over months of working together, the farmer and Kenji developed mutual respect. They communicated through broken English, gestures, and shared work. The farmer's wife started including Kenji in family meals. When Kenji was repatriated, the farmer gave him seeds from his best vegetables, telling him through an interpreter to plant them in Japan and remember that people on both sides wanted peace. Kenji kept those seeds for decades, eventually planting them in his own garden in Japan, growing American vegetables as a living reminder of unexpected friendship. The psychological concept of cognitive dissonance helps explain the mental and emotional challenges prisoners faced. They held beliefs about honor, shame, American brutality, and Japanese superiority. They had been taught that capture was worse than death. Then they surrendered and discovered that consequences did not match expectations. They were treated with basic decency. They were fed abundantly. They were allowed to maintain dignity. These experiences contradicted their beliefs, creating psychological discomfort that had to be resolved. Some prisoners resolved this dissonance by clinging to their old beliefs, insisting that American treatment was manipulation or that they should have died rather than surrender. Others resolved it by changing their beliefs, accepting that propaganda was false and that different understandings of honor and humanity were possible. The process was painful either way. Beliefs are not easily changed, but daily experience of eating well, being treated fairly, and living in conditions that preserved health made maintaining the old beliefs increasingly difficult. The role of music and entertainment in camps deserves mention. Prisoners organized musical groups, theatrical performances, and sports competitions. These activities provided psychological relief and helped maintain morale. Food featured in entertainment in various ways. Prisoners wrote songs about meals, performing them for each other. They created comedy sketches about the abundance of food, using humor to process their surreal circumstances. Sports competitions often had food-related prizes, with winners receiving extra desserts or canteen scrip. One camp organized a cooking competition where prisoners prepared Japanese dishes using available ingredients. American administrators provided the ingredients, and Japanese-American staff judged the results. The winner received a special food package. These activities used food as a medium for maintaining cultural identity and community bonds, while adapting to captivity. The seasonal cycles of camp life included food-related traditions that blended Japanese and American cultures. Some camps celebrated both American holidays and Japanese festivals, with special meals marking these occasions. On Japanese New Year, prisoners might receive rice cakes and special dishes prepared by prisoner cooks, using American ingredients adapted to Japanese recipes. On American Thanksgiving, prisoners received turkey and traditional American holiday foods. These hybrid celebrations created strange but meaningful moments. Prisoners eating turkey and stuffing while also honoring Japanese traditions represented the cultural mixing that captivity forced upon them. Some prisoners later reported that these mixed celebrations, while initially feeling wrong or inappropriate, eventually helped them see that different cultures could coexist without one destroying the other. The letters prisoners wrote home, once mail service was established in late 1945 and early 1946, provide intimate glimpses into their thoughts and feelings. Many prisoners struggled with what to tell their families. They wanted to reassure loved ones that they were alive and well. But explaining their conditions was complicated. If they described the food honestly, would their families believe them? Would family members feel betrayed knowing their captured relatives ate better than civilians in Japan? Many prisoners chose careful language, saying they were being treated adequately without elaborating. Others described the food in detail, wanting their families to know they were healthy, but also wanting to document the stark differences between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. These letters, many, preserved in family archives or historical collections, reveal the internal conflicts prisoners navigated when trying to communicate their experiences. One preserved letter from a prisoner to his wife is particularly moving. He writes that he is healthy and has gained weight. He describes the food briefly, mentioning that meals are sufficient and that he has access to a camp store. But then he asks about conditions at home, expressing deep worry about whether his wife and children have enough to eat. He sends her money from his camp earnings, hoping it will help buy food on the black market. He tells her he dreams of the day when he can return home and ensure his family never goes hungry again. The letter captures the terrible irony of his situation. A father who is well fed while his children starve, unable to share his food or provide for them, separated by war and ocean and circumstance. This emotional reality, multiplied across thousands of prisoners, created trauma that lasted lifetimes. Many former prisoners never fully resolved the guilt of surviving well while their families suffered. The end of repatriation and the final days in American camps brought mixed emotions. Prisoners wanted to go home, but also felt anxiety about returning to a devastated Japan. Some prisoners had established routines in the camps, had made friends, had adapted to American life. Leaving meant returning to uncertainty, ruined cities, food shortages, and a society that might view them with shame. The final meals in camps took on symbolic weight. Prisoners knew these would be their last American meals, possibly their last good meals for a long time. Some camps organized special farewell dinners for prisoners about to be repatriated, serving favorite foods and allowing prisoners to make requests. These meals were bittersweet, marking the end of a strange period that had been simultaneously captivity and refuge. As ships carrying repatriated prisoners approached Japan, the men gathered on deck to see their homeland. Many wept at the sight of Japan, overcome with emotion. But the tears mixed joy with grief. They were home, but home was destroyed. They had survived, but survival brought complicated feelings. The contrast between the America they were leaving and the Japan they were returning to could not have been starker. In America, they had eaten 3 meals a day. In Japan, they would struggle to find food. This knowledge, clear and unavoidable, shaped their final hours on the ships. Some prisoners hoarded food from the final ship meals, saving bits of bread or fruit to bring ashore, trying to hold on to American abundance for a little longer. Others ate nothing, their stomachs tight with anxiety about what awaited them on shore. The decades after repatriation saw former prisoners scatter across Japan, returning to their homes or settling in new places. Most tried to rebuild their lives in a country struggling with devastation and occupation. The American treatment of prisoners had prepared them, perhaps better than any other Japanese citizens, to interact with American occupation forces. They understood that Americans followed certain rules and procedures. They knew that cooperation could lead to fair treatment. They had evidence from their own experience that Americans were not the demons propaganda portrayed. This knowledge made some former prisoners valuable as intermediaries between occupation authorities and Japanese civilians. They could explain American expectations. They could translate not just language but cultural assumptions. They could reduce friction and misunderstanding. But this role also made them suspect to some Japanese. Working with occupation forces, even helpfully, carried stigma. Being too comfortable with Americans, understanding them too well, suggested insufficient loyalty to Japan. Former prisoners walked a careful line, using their knowledge when needed, but not advertising their experiences. Many downplayed their time in American camps, not wanting to be seen as collaborators or as men who had it easy while others suffered. The complex legacy of captivity followed them for years, influencing their relationships, careers, and self-perception. As Japan's recovery accelerated in the 1950s and economic growth exploded in the 1960s and 1970s, the former prisoners watched their country transform. American aid, technology transfer, and trade relationships helped fuel this growth. Japan adopted many American business practices, studied American production methods, and integrated into the American-led international economic order. Former prisoners, who had lived inside American abundance and studied American systems, recognized elements of what they had seen in the camps now being applied to rebuild Japan. The emphasis on efficiency, organization, and production that created the ability to feed prisoners so well was being shared with Japan to help reconstruction. Some former prisoners contributed directly to this process, using their language skills and cultural knowledge to facilitate technology transfer and business relationships. They were living bridges between the two nations, built through the unlikely experience of captivity. The story continues to resonate into the present. Historians study POW camps to understand the Pacific War's complexity, the treatment of prisoners, and the development of post-war Japanese-American relations. Museums in both countries preserve artifacts and testimonies from the camps. Descendants of former prisoners sometimes visit the campsites in America, trying to understand their father's or grandfather's experience. These visits can be emotional, standing on ground where a loved one spent years in captivity, trying to imagine what life was like in these places. Some visitors describe feeling strange gratitude toward America for treating their relatives well, mixed with continued grief over the war and its costs. The final survivors of the camps, now in their 90s or having recently passed away, carried unique perspectives to the end of their lives. They were the last living witnesses to this specific historical moment. They could describe from personal experience what it meant to transition from starving soldier to well-fed prisoner, from believing propaganda to encountering contradictory reality, from expecting death to receiving life. Their testimonies, recorded by historians and filmmakers, preserve voices that will soon be silent forever. When the last survivor dies, as will inevitably happen soon, the camps will exist only in records and memories, no longer in living experience. The transition from lived history to recorded history is happening now, making the preservation of these stories urgent and important. The food that started this entire narrative, those generous servings that stunned and confused Japanese prisoners, remains central to understanding the experience. The meals were not just nutrition, but communication. They said something about American values, American capacity, and American choices. They demonstrated that even in war, even toward enemies, certain standards would be maintained. They showed that abundance was not just for Americans, but was part of a system that, whatever its flaws, produced enough to share even with those who had been trying to kill them. This was soft power before the term existed. This feeding of enemies that changed their understanding of who their enemy was. The giant servings, the camp canteens, the holiday meals, the seconds offered without hesitation, all of this added up to a message. America is different from what you were told. See for yourself. Taste for yourself. Draw your own conclusions. And they did draw conclusions. They concluded that they had been lied to. They concluded that America was more powerful than they imagined. They concluded that different systems produced different results, They concluded that enemies could be human. They concluded that survival was better than dying for false honor. They concluded that the future might be different from the past. These conclusions, reached through the simple experience of eating and being treated fairly, helped shape the post-war world. The Japanese prisoners who returned home carrying these conclusions contributed to Japan's transformation from enemy to ally, from militarist empire to democratic partner, from devastated nation to economic powerhouse. The food was never just food. It was evidence of an alternative way of organizing society, and that evidence, tasted and digested and metabolized into the very bodies of former prisoners, became part of the foundation for a new relationship between nations that had been locked in brutal warfare. This is the deeper meaning of the story, the reason it matters beyond historical curiosity.